It's often been said that all roads lead to Rome, and for many people of the Catholic faith, a journey to Rome, and the Vatican to be more precise, is the ultimate act of devotion. A pilgrimage to hear the Pope address the crowds in St. Peter's Square, or for the more fortunate again, an actual audience with the Pope, is the experience of a lifetime, and always to be treasured. Although there are occasions when the Pope visits the nations of the world, blessing the faithful, Rome is at the beating heart of the papacy, and for very good reason. To appreciate the true heritage and splendour of the papacy, pilgrims only need stand in St. Peter's Square and look towards the great basilica to realise that this is indeed a remarkable place, and that the Pope, whether you happen to be of the Catholic faith or not, always has been and always will be an iconic figure of power worldwide. Without doubt, the Pope is both the most visible and the most famous symbol of Catholicism, and even in the 21st century has links that go right back to the birth of Christ. From the Greek word papus, that very simply means father, the Pope has the ultimate power legislatively, executively, and judicially within the Catholic Church. From a doctrinal point of view, each pope that there's ever been is considered the rightful successor of St. Peter, the disciple of Jesus Christ, who was entrusted with the administration of the Christian Church after Jesus was crucified by the Romans. Peter came to Rome to establish a Christian community before he too was executed as a martyr for his faith. Although some describe St. Peter as the first pope, the tradition didn't start immediately after Peter's death. During the early years, as Christianity became established, a bishop of Rome was elected by the people. Gradually, over time, the bishops and the nobility from the surrounding area began to make the decisions about who should lead the church. And eventually, it was the Roman emperor himself who was called upon to ratify the appointment of a pope. With a huge empire stretching far and wide, as well as having great significance in the Roman capital, any man elected to the office of Pope had a political role also, influencing people's lives far beyond the confines of Rome. Today, the election of a new Pope is guaranteed to make headline news, and the devoted gather from all over the world in St. Peter's Square to watch for the smoke billowing from this Vatican chimney, while millions watch the television broadcasts. A white plume of smoke indicates that a new Pope has been appointed, but black smoke lets everyone know that the decision has still not been made. Whoever is destined to be Pope is of international significance. Back in the early days of the papacy, it was an equally global matter. By the time the Roman Empire fell, after the city of Rome was sacked in AD 410, the position of the Pope was beyond that of a religious figurehead. The Pope controlled Rome and its environs, raised and led armies, levied taxes, decreed where people should live and how they should behave. Back in 452, Pope Leo I left the city to meet with Attila the Hun on a mission to convince one of history's most fearsome warriors to withdraw his armies. As the years passed, papal involvement in politics increased, and to this day the appointment of the Pope is more than a religious event, with Vatican City actually being an independent sovereign state. That Rome is an incredible city is unmistakable, where the influence of Roman civilization and the papacy can be seen wherever you look. But to find the real origins of the men who became Pope, we need to journey back to the Holy Land, where the history of Christianity and the Catholic faith began. The story of the Nativity, the birth of Christ, is familiar throughout the world, and Mary, the mother of Christ, is not surprisingly at the heart of it. In Catholic churches and cathedrals, the figure of the Blessed Virgin is dominant, and as well as being viewed as the Mother of God, she is also venerated as the Mother of the Church. But for all Mary's splendour and grand depictions, from a more historical and sociological point of view, she was actually a fairly unremarkable young woman who lived in the Judean fishing village of Nazareth in Galilee. Judea was, at the time of Christ's birth, a small Roman province that today is better known as Israel and the Palestinian territories. Like so many countries, Judea was part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman occupation had a significant part to play in the birth of Christianity. Mary was betrothed to Joseph, a humble carpenter, but not married, when she was told by the angel Gabriel that she'd been chosen to give birth to the Son of God through an immaculate conception. In Jewish law, there are two parts to a marriage: the betrothal, or the engagement, and then the marriage ceremony a year later. For an innocent Jewish peasant girl, despite being of good family, finding herself pregnant while betrothed would have been nothing short of disaster. Had Joseph chosen to cast her aside, knowing that the child she was carrying wasn't his, Mary's life would have in effect been over. Many who study the Christian faith do find the concept of a virgin birth sometimes difficult to accept, but symbolising the purity of Mary and her utter faith in God, it's the fundamental principle that puts Mary at the epicentre of Catholic worship. By the time Jesus began his ministry, others who would take up prominent roles in the spread of Christianity were called into his service. There were 12 apostles, disciples of Christ, with the first of them being the Saint Peter, whose mortal remains are believed to be buried in the tomb beneath the Vatican. When Jesus asked Peter to join him, he was known by the name of Simon, but it was Christ who called him Peter, meaning rock. Just as Mary was destined to become the mother of the Catholic Church, St. Peter was destined to be the rock that would be its foundation. For the Romans occupying Judea and its governor Pontius Pilate, Jesus and his disciples were an unsettling force. And when Jesus was captured and then executed, Pilate believed that the danger of insurrection was over. Little could anyone have realised at that critical moment in time that the Roman Empire was destined to fall, and that the crucifixion of the prophet who preached peace and love to all mankind would start a faith that would continue into the next millennium and beyond. In the Christian Church, whether Catholic or not, the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection is what offers mere mortals the promise of eternal life. That Christ suffered a slow, painful death on the cross at Calvary, just outside Jerusalem's first-century walls, to atone for the sins of mankind, was the message taken by his disciples to the rest of the world. And with Rome being at the heart of a major global power at this time, it wasn't long before the message of Christianity reached the city. For a society that relied upon slavery, The notion of all men being equal in the sight of God and equally worthy of salvation was a dangerous one, and the early Christians didn't receive the warm welcome in Rome that today's pilgrims experience. Just as the Roman authorities in Judea did their best to put a halt to such doctrines, the early Christians in Rome were ruthlessly persecuted. There are two patron saints of Rome, St. Peter, who we've already encountered, and St. Paul, who actually led the way for the apostles. St. Paul was one of the first to be converted to Christianity by an encounter with Jesus after his resurrection on the road to Damascus. A Pharisee and a Roman citizen who'd previously persecuted Christians in Judea, he became a devout apostle, spreading the story of Christ throughout the Roman Empire, founding churches in Asia Minor and Greece, as well as Rome itself. You only have to look at the books of the New Testament to see how far he travelled, as Paul's letters to such groups of Christians as the Ephesians, the Corinthians, the Thessalonians and the Romans make up a large proportion of the latter part of the Bible. What St. Paul found in Rome was a major civilization that had been centuries in the making. Rome's history spans more than 2,500 years, having been the capital of the Roman kingdom, dating back to 753 BC, before it became a republic and then an empire. Spanning either side of the river Tiber, legend has it that it was founded by Romulus, one of the legendary twins rescued from a basket set afloat on the river and raised by a she-wolf. From its early beginnings on Palatine Hill, which today shadows the magnificent ruins of the Forum, the Roman Empire rose to prominence. Although in ruins, the Forum is still dramatic, where the temples of the ancient Roman gods that predated Christianity can be identified. One of the oldest is the Temple of Saturn, erected in about 500 BC. And when St. Paul and St. Peter reached Rome as Christian missionaries, they had a huge challenge to face, introducing the concept of only one God. The Romans had a god for all aspects of their lives, just as the ancient Greeks did, and it would be long after the martyrdom of St. Peter, St. Paul, and many of the early popes before Christianity would be accepted. The first Christians in Rome met in secret, encouraged by the ministries of the brave apostles. They identified each other by the sign of the fish, a Christian symbol to this day. But as the Roman Empire started its decline, the Christians were frequently blamed for the troubles faced by Roman society. By the time Nero became emperor in AD 54, absolute power was set to corrupt absolutely. Nero was still in his teens when he became emperor, and over time, his corruption, cruelty and excess brought Roman civilization to the brink of ruin. However, he had a very convenient and ready-made scapegoat in the Christians. As Rome burned in AD 64, Nero declared it was the Christians who'd set fire to the city. The persecution that followed was cruel beyond human understanding, with Christians fed to the lions as great public spectacles, while others were covered in oil and burned as torches to light the city. Interestingly, the Colosseum is the Roman amphitheatre most closely associated with the martyrdom of Christians, but this actually came a little later. Nero ruled until AD 68, so it was Emperor Vespasian in AD 72 who founded the Colosseum in the grounds where Nero's palace had stood. For the very early Christians, the place of public slaughter would have been Nero's circus of chariot races. And if we return to the Vatican and St. Peter's Square, we'll discover how the man charged with the care of the Christian Church was martyred. At the centre of the square, there's an imposing obelisk that was brought to Rome by one of Nero's equally despotic predecessors, Caligula, in AD 36. It had pride of place at Nero's circus on Vatican Hill, and it was before the obelisk that St. Peter was executed. In the persecutions after the fire of Rome, St. Peter was captured and crucified, but declared he was unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus, so elected to be crucified upside down. When the obelisk was moved here in honour of St. Peter in the late 1600s, on the orders of Pope Sixtus V, as a mark of respect, the workman who took 4 months to relocate it had to do it in silence. The penalty for speaking, ironically, would have been death. St. Paul was also captured and sentenced to death, but because of his Roman citizenship was spared the horrors of crucifixion, and as was his right, he was beheaded. It's said that Pope Linus, a native Italian, appointed circa AD 67, was the choice of both St. Peter and St. Paul. And this is how the succession of popes as we know them today began. Anyone who sets foot upon the Vatican's hallowed ground can sense this eternal process. The square, museums and basilica, although built many centuries after the very first popes were martyred for their faith, is a constant reminder of all those who held office while inspiring all those who will become pope in the years to come. From the 140 saints high above the piazza to the magnificent dome designed by Michelangelo, this is indeed a holy place. Inside the basilica, the canopy of gilded bronze above the Pope's altar stands constant vigil over the tomb of St. Peter, reminding each new pontiff of the religion, tradition and heritage that he will be called upon to uphold and advance. The history of the papacy is truly remarkable, but impossible to look at in detail in such a short time. But we can, nonetheless, take a whistle-stop tour of the great, the good, and perhaps not quite so good, who've been elected to the office of Pope. To help set the various popes in context, it'll be useful to split the papacy into 3 periods of history: the early church, the Middle Ages, and the modern era. As we've already discovered, being Pope in the early church was a very dangerous business indeed, and there's little information about the men who became Bishop of Rome after St. Peter, many of whom were martyred for their Christian faith. Interestingly, we do know from St. Mark's Gospel in the New Testament that St. Peter was married. But as a priest, even from the early years, the Pope was expected to be unmarried or to have put aside a wife if he had one previously and be celibate. With the passage of time, this abstinence has been demanded of all those honoured with the title Pope, even if there were occasions, most notably through the Middle Ages, when such moral expectations were not always adhered to. Things changed within the papacy when Constantine the Great became Emperor of Rome in AD 306. As the first Christian Roman emperor, he put a stop to the persecution of his fellow Christians, and until his death in 337, he changed the papacy dramatically. Between 324 and 330, Constantine built a new capital for the Roman Empire in the east, which is to be found in modern-day Turkey. Named in his honour, Byzantium was transformed into Constantinople, the city we know in the 21st century as Istanbul. This is not to say that Constantine neglected Rome. This was far from being the case. On his orders, construction work began on Old St. Peter's Basilica in around 326. In more ways than one, Constantine had made his mark on the Christian faith that he'd made his own. And from Pope St. Miltiades onwards, the papacy no longer faced persecution for simply existing. Even so, despite the spread of power during the reign of Constantine, the days of the mighty Roman Empire were already numbered. By the 5th century, it was in serious decline, and after Alaric's sack of Rome in 401, the position of Pope held significant political as well as religious power. And to see this illustrated, visitors to the Vatican need only follow the River Tiber a short distance to the magnificent Castle St. Angelo, which came under direct attack from Alaric and the Visigoths in the sack of Rome. Originally constructed in about AD 135, this cylindrical masterpiece was the tomb of the Emperor Hadrian, where his ashes were laid to rest, along with those of a number of subsequent emperors. Hadrian also built the beautiful bridge that leads to the castle, although the statues of the angels all along it are a later Baroque addition. Hadrian's tomb, as aesthetically pleasing as it undoubtedly must have been, came in very useful in the sack of Rome, being quickly converted into a fortress. And from that time onwards, the papacy found a refuge in the Castle St. Angelo when under attack. Even today, visitors to the castle, now a museum, will be amazed at the historic guns and armour to be found within these walls. Many popes down through the ages owed their survival to this stronghold, aided further by a specially constructed, concealed and fortified corridor that ran between the Vatican and the castle. Known as the Passetto di Borgo, the passageway was built in the 14th century by Pope Nicholas III. The papal state also used this thick-walled fortress as a prison and a place of execution. The statue of the Archangel Michael at the top of the castle is a familiar part of Rome's beautiful skyline, who it was said appeared above the castle with his sword in hand after Rome was delivered from the plague of AD 590. In the aftermath of the fall of Rome, the Pope became a dominant symbol of authority and continuity. Gregory the Great, who reigned supreme between 540 and 604, represented a shift from the classical to the medieval outlook as the political climate evolved. The popes that followed Gregory became very aware of the need for friends in high places, and when Leo III crowned Charlemagne at the altar in St. Peter's Basilica as the first Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800, he set the precedent that no man could now become emperor without first being anointed by the Pope. The papacy struggled to reign supreme between the 9th and the 11th centuries as political factions worldwide vied for power. Nicholas I, in Rome, claimed that the Pope should have authority over all Christians, and even royalty in matters of faith and morals. But the Bishop of Constantinople had other ideas, as a rift between the Church in the East and the West began to widen. It's hard to believe, looking at the splendour and dignity of the Vatican today, some of the strange events that took place during this period. One of the most bizarre is the story of Pope Formosus and his brief reign between 891 and 896. After facing many political complications, Formosus died. But when Pope Stephen VI became Pope in 897, he was determined that Formosus should be called to account. The body of the deceased Pope was disinterred, dressed in papal attire, and brought to trial in what's gone down in history as the Cadaver Synod. Found unworthy of being Pope, the corpse was stripped of the vestments, the 3 fingers he used in consecrations were cut from his right hand, and what remained of Formosus was thrown into the river Tiber. A monk rescued the mutilated corpse from the river, and when Stephen VI died, Formosus was reinterred at St. Peter's, and further trials of the dead were banned by the papacy. But Formosus was still unable to rest in peace. Pope Sergius III, who came to power in 904, once more exhumed Formosus and had him tried and found guilty all over again, and this time beheaded the corpse, which subsequently disappeared. It's a strange tale, but in 1054, another act of papal justice had far more reaching consequences. In Rome, Pope Leo IX excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael I Severus, while Michael, in return, excommunicated Leo. It marked the beginning of a historic split where the Church in the West broke away from the Church in the East. Moving into the Middle Ages, the powerful Roman Church frequently went up against the monarchs of Europe. As a result of various disagreements, between 1309 and 1377, a succession of French popes ceased residing in Rome. During a period known as the Avignon Papacy moved to France. With the political map of the world undergoing vast change, the Catholic Church did itself few favours with the enemies of France, most notably the English. It's also a period in the history of the papacy notorious for greed and corruption, and although the residency of the Pope was eventually restored to Rome, much damage had been done. However, a new age was dawning that would not only influence the papacy and Catholicism, but would also mould mankind's cultural heritage beyond recognition. One thing that is evident for modern-day visitors to Rome is the link between the Church and art. From the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica to the city's tiniest churches, magnificent frescoes, sculptures and paintings decorate these most beautiful places of worship. The style is opulent and undeniably breathtaking, and the names of the world's best-known artists loudly resonate from the past. Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael and Michelangelo perfected their skills under the patronage of the rich and powerful papacy. The evidence can still be seen today in the hallowed corridors of the Vatican. But this is much more than art we're talking about. From the 14th to the 17th century, a cultural movement spread from its earliest beginnings in the Italian city of Florence to the farthest corners of Europe. Known as the Renaissance, which means rebirth, this intellectual revolution spanned science, philosophy and politics, as well as the arts. As we have discovered through the course of this programme, the election of a pope is of major importance, and when the cardinals meet to make their decision, they do so in the Sistine Chapel, an undoubted jewel in the papacy crown. The ceiling paintings of the chapel depict scenes from the Book of Genesis, complete with the iconic image of the hand of God giving life to Adam, very probably the most famous works of Michelangelo, who is said to have inspired the term Renaissance man. The Pope who entrusted the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling to Michelangelo was Julius II, who, rather ironically, was known as the Warrior Pope. His aggressive campaign for political control was legendary, but his eye for fine art is the real legacy that he left the papacy, as he also commissioned many works from Raphael. In 1506, he laid the foundation stone for St. Peter's Basilica as you see it today, the same year that he also founded the Swiss Guard, the Vatican's dedicated security force. As well as being renowned for his painting and sculpting, Michelangelo was also appointed the architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica, and the magnificent dome was built to his design, although sadly he didn't live long enough to see it finished. A true Renaissance man, Michelangelo was a painter, sculptor, architect, poet and engineer, as diversely talented as his contemporary rivals Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. All were way ahead of their time, as verified by Leonardo's designs for tanks and helicopters that can be seen alongside the sketches for his magnificent paintings. The tomb of Raphael can be found in one of Rome's most incredible buildings, where he actually requested to be buried. The Pantheon is the perfect place for a true genius of the Renaissance to have been laid to rest, as it is a marvel of Roman engineering dating back to the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century. The grandeur of Raphael's tomb is an indication of how important he was considered to be. The commissions he received from the Vatican were instrumental in creating his iconic status. However, the Renaissance was far from being the only instrument of change and development during this period of history. Despite the best efforts of Julius II, the sins of his predecessors, Pope Alexander VI in particular, had put the papacy in a very precarious position. The rock that the Christian Church had been founded upon all the way back to St. Peter was about to be shaken. The Protestant Reformation had its origins in 1517, when Martin Luther, a German priest, preached the message of personal salvation through grace and faith in Jesus Christ. Much of the great wealth of the papacy had accumulated as a result of the rich paying vast sums of money to the Church in return for absolution from sin. Known as the sale of indulgences, this corrupt practice was at the heart of Luther's grievances, and Alexander VI, who'd died in 1503, had used this papal power to feather his own nest. The name Alexander VI may not ring too many bells of recognition, but when you learn that his birth name was Rodrigo Borgia, it's quite a different matter. Bearing in mind that, as priests first and foremost, a pope fathering children is definitely frowned upon, the Borgia dynasty was unusual from the outset. By the time he became pope, Rodrigo Borgia had 4 children by a mistress. They were all put into positions of power. Lucretia, his daughter, was married to a number of men useful to her family, who often died mysteriously once they'd served their purpose. The eldest son, Giovanni, was murdered, and in his grief, Pope Alexander shut himself away in the castle of St. Angelo. Matters were made a great deal worse because rumour has it that it was actually the Pope's second son, Cesare, who was responsible for killing his brother. Without doubt, the Borgias were detrimental to the papacy, and before his election, Pope Julius II, our warrior pope, had attempted to have Alexander VI deposed. But those who live by the sword often die by it, and with the Borgia being synonymous with suspicious poisonings, Alexander VI died horrifically, with poison cited as the most likely cause. An interesting footnote is that the Pope who followed Alexander VI, Pius III, forbade a mass for his predecessor, saying, "It is blasphemous to pray for the damned." He also ensured that burial did not take place in St. Peter's. The flames of Reformation and the spark of the Protestant movement were naturally fanned by the excesses of the Borgia, and with Caxton's invention of the printing press, news of such corruption reached a much wider audience. Martin Luther and the Reformers made extensive use of simple pamphlets, and soon Protestant groups were forming in Switzerland and Scotland, as well as in Germany. Luther also translated the Bible from Latin so that ordinary people could read the Word of God for themselves rather than having to go through the interpretation of a priest. The papacy fought back, excommunicating Luther, but the Protestant cause was about to receive a further boost from an unexpected quarter. In London, another Renaissance man sat on the throne of England. Young Henry VIII was crowned king in 1509, and as the Protestant Reformation gathered pace, he staunchly opposed it, brutally suppressing the movement in England. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess and widow of his older brother, who'd died before their union could be consummated. Henry had needed permission from the Pope, again Julius II, for the wedding to go ahead, and a papal bull was granted to allow the marriage to take place. All was well for a while, until Queen Catherine failed to produce a male heir, only giving birth to one living child, a daughter, Mary. Henry wanted a son, and having already fathered illegitimate boys, went back to the Vatican to get his marriage to Catherine annulled so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, who he was convinced would give him a son. But a papal bull was complex to overturn, and posed a huge problem for the new Pope, Clement VII. Henry claimed that Catherine's marriage to Arthur had been consummated, and the facts previously presented were lies, something which the Queen fiercely denied. The Vatican refused Henry's entreaties for an annulment to set Catherine aside, and on learning that Anne Boleyn was already carrying his child, there was no time to be lost in diplomatic negotiations with the Vatican for a divorce. So Henry took matters into his own hands, and in 1533 broke away from Rome to create himself the head of a new Protestant Church of England in order to marry Anne and produce a legitimate heir. Rome and the Catholic Church had lost a valuable ally in the fight against Protestantism, but the religious state of England was as yet far from being set in stone. Anne Boleyn's child was a girl, Elizabeth, and when Henry's new queen also failed to produce a living male heir, charges were brought against her and she was executed as a traitor. Henry then married Jane Seymour, who did give him a son, Edward, but she died shortly after giving birth. 3 more wives followed, but no more children, and when Henry died, he was succeeded by his young son Edward, whose advisers kept England Protestant. However, Roman sympathisers in the English court were ready and waiting for their opportunity to restore the nation to the Catholic faith, and when the boy king, who'd always been prone to illness, died in 1553, they had their chance. Catherine of Aragon's daughter Mary was true to Rome, and was ready to restore Catholicism to England, and when she was crowned queen, she duly did. Overnight, the Protestant bishops of the Church of England were forced to convert to Catholicism, or face being burned at the stake. This statue is of Bishop John Hooper, who refused to become Catholic on Queen Mary's orders and died here by fire as a result. When Mary married the Catholic Philip of Spain, the papacy would have felt secure that England was now safe again, as the couple's children would carry on the Catholic succession, but fate stepped in once more. Mary was unable to produce a living heir, male or female. When she died after a brief but bloody 5-year reign, the throne passed to her sister Elizabeth, the Protestant daughter of Anne Boleyn. Again, overnight, England changed faith, becoming Protestant once more, and it wasn't long before it was Catholic bishops being burned at the stake for refusing to become Protestant. To support their priests, the papacy backed a network of Catholic safe houses throughout England, where the faithful could worship in secret. Even harbouring a priest carried the death penalty, and here you can see concealed priest holes in an English country house, which were frequently used during Elizabeth's reign. With the Vatican and its supporters hoping Elizabeth would marry a Catholic or be overthrown by her Catholic cousin Mary Queen of Scots, England steadily became as well established as a Protestant nation as any of those inspired by Martin Luther. Elizabeth I ruled for an incredible 44 years. By the time of her death in 1603, the Church of England was secure as the faith of the nation. Returning to the Vatican now, as the Renaissance and the Reformation continued to gather pace, the papacy instigated what's gone down in history as the Roman Inquisition, not to be confused with the Spanish Inquisition. The aim was to protect and maintain Catholic orthodoxy and combat the spread of Protestantism, with individuals prosecuted for heresy. Immorality, blasphemy, and witchcraft, to mention but a few examples of heresy, were all treated as criminal activities, and literature was heavily censored for fear of it being subversive. The most famous trial under the Roman Inquisition was that of Galileo, the astronomer, who discovered that the Earth orbited around the Sun rather than it being the other way around. Up until Galileo's findings, the established thinking was that the Sun orbited the Earth, which was exactly how the papacy believed it should remain. Galileo was silenced after being tried and judged to be a heretic, and his work was banned. Unlike some who'd been found guilty under the Roman Inquisition, he wasn't imprisoned in the Castle Sant'Angelo or executed, but effectively his scientific career was left in ruins. Galileo remained under house arrest until his death in 1642. It would be almost 100 years later that Pope Benedict XIV authorised the publication of Galileo's work, and the scientist's brilliant discovery was recognised. It's interesting to note that Pope John Paul II expressed regret at the way in which Galileo had been treated in 1992. And as we move forward now to look at the popes of the modern era, it is this remarkable pontiff from Poland who's played a huge part in the shaping of a Catholic Church that is relevant for the 21st century and beyond. It took many years, centuries in fact, for the papacy to become restored as the spiritual and religious authority that it is today. traditional election of popes maintained continuity, but the world changed at a rapid pace. Those elected to the papacy were all Italian after Adrian VI, the only Dutch pope who served between 1522 and 1533, until Pope John Paul II's reign began in 1978. Revolution and conflict changed the destiny of the papacy, and even when the battles fought were not on Italian soil, the ripple effect always reached Rome. A prime example is the French Revolution of 1789, when after an assault on the Bastille prison in Paris, the peasant workers attacked the aristocracy in response to the excesses of their hedonistic lifestyle. You only have to look at the magnificent Palace of Versailles, home to King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, to see the lavish way in which they lived, while the people they had sovereignty over starved. Cries of liberty, equality and fraternity heralded a brutal overthrow of the French ruling classes as the aristocrats were beheaded at the guillotine. This may well have been a salutary warning to the papacy against excessive living, but more tangibly than that, the French Revolution made the nation's citizens turn against Christianity, preventing expected revenues from the faithful of France from pouring into the Vatican treasury. The Napoleonic Wars that followed the French Revolution further disturbed the status quo, and by the 1860s, a dispute between the Italian government and the papacy had a dramatic impact much closer to home for Pope Pius IX. Enjoying a 31-year reign, Pius, who opened the First Vatican Council, is the longest-serving pope to date. But his final 8 years were as a virtual prisoner, albeit within the Vatican. For 13 centuries, the beautiful city of Florence had been the government of Italy's capital, but in 1861, Rome was restored as Italy's premier city. However, the Catholic Church held Vatican City, and it would take all the way through to 1929 and the Lateran Treaty for matters to be properly resolved. When Pope Pius XI signed the treaty in 1929, Vatican City was once and for all established as a sovereign state, and it remains so to this day. Interestingly, throughout this period of papal history, between 1861 and 1929, the popes became more focused on religious rather than political matters. During World War I, between 1914 and 1918, Pope Benedict XV stepped forward to assist in brokering peace. But in Italy, a new threat emerged from the armistice, person of Italy's fascist Prime Minister, Benito Mussolini. A papal letter declared that it was impossible to be a Catholic and a fascist, and the relationship between Mussolini and the papacy was destined to be a difficult one. As the 20th century progressed, with Mussolini controlling Italy and Adolf Hitler rising to power in Nazi Germany, a Second World War became inevitable. To avoid being drawn into the conflict, the Vatican declared neutrality, which Adolf Hitler respected, despite Rome being occupied by the Nazis until its liberation by the Allied forces in 1944. After World War II, Pope Pius XII turned his attention to helping war-torn Europe and internationalised the College of Cardinals, adding to its numbers from all over the world. The Catholic Church was now favouring theological innovation and reform, which was emphasised in the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s. Pope John XXIII announced the Church's intention to make Catholic worship more accessible, and known as Good Pope John, he set a standard for modern pontiffs that is much respected. Another aspect of the fast-changing world of the 1960s was the opportunities that were opening up for travel, and Pope Paul VI became the first pope to visit the USA. Also, along with his Orthodox counterpart, the mutual excommunication of 1054, separating the Church in the East from the West that we considered earlier in this programme, was finally lifted in 1965. When Pope Paul VI died in 1978, he'd visited all 5 continents of the world and had worked consistently to expand the reach of the Catholic Church beyond the bounds of Europe. The fact that he was also renowned as a man of great joy led the way for Pope John Paul II to give an even greater sense of joy to the people of the world throughout his 26-year reign. What the future will hold for the papacy is impossible to anticipate. Even the small percentage of the popes that we've had a brief glimpse at in this programme were exceptional, if not always for the right reasons. Following on in the international footsteps of both Pope Paul VI and John Paul II, the German-born Pope Benedict XVI is not only the first of that nation to hold the office, he's also the oldest pontiff elected to the papacy since Clement XII in 1730. There are still rifts to be mended and controversies that cry out for papal wisdom. But in a world where religious tolerance has never been more important, there is a real and significant role for the Pope to play in brokering and maintaining peace on earth. What has gone before is a testament to the papacy's tenacity. What it has endured has made it stronger, and having come this far since St. Peter laid the foundations for the Christian Church some 2,000 years ago, there will indeed be a pope for all seasons and a papacy for each new generation.